Happy Friday. I have a real 2 nickels situation with today's book in that if I had a nickel for every time I teared up outside the bookseller in Chicago after picking up my Sarah Hollowell release and realizing I'm unexpectedly in the acknowledgements, I would have 2 nickels, which doesn't seem like a lot, but weird that it happened twice. Now, while I admittedly really don't know the context of that reference, the fact that it is finally applicable in my life, mind-blowing. But truly, I picked up my copy of What Stalks Among Us yesterday, and I did flip to the acknowledgements because I love reading how Sarah's voice translates to the acknowledgements, because if you are new to me, I admittedly am a friend of Sarah's. We were college friends. That becomes pertinent in today's video and how I connected with this book in ways that felt incredibly personal because of that. But I was not expecting to see my name in this book, and it did make me quite emotional. So that is not necessarily a brag, except maybe a little bit. Like, it means a lot to me that I have meant anything to Sarah in that way, because she means a whole lot to me. Her work means a whole lot to me. And in that vein, hopefully today will be a little tighter than usual. I know I say this every week, and I know I never succeed, and my odds of succeeding today are slim. However, I'm going to try, because the goal is in October to have Sarah on and to be able to discuss What Stalks Among Us in more depth with Sarah, which I am looking forward to so much after really digging into this book. I mean, I was looking forward to it regardless, but there is so much to discuss here. And along with that, whether you've read this book or maybe you've read A Dark and Starless Forest, that's the front, which I've also talked about in a Feature Friday. If you have questions for Sarah about her work, either of her works, please leave them below and I will hopefully integrate them somehow into that discussion. I have not decided what that's going to look like yet, in the sense of whether it's going to be pre-recorded or live streamed. I feel like probably not live streamed, as much as it would be great to have that organic conversation, just because I'm not as familiar with that, but we will see. I'm making no promises either way. If you have a preference, I guess let me know below. But as usual, unfortunately with that, no promises, because I don't want to disappoint you. What will not disappoint you is this book. Again, the usual caveats. Taste is subjective. Sarah is my friend. But as I said with A Dark and Starless Forest, I would be a fan of Sarah's voice regardless, because it has a lot of what I really love. It has a real kind of sense of the odd and the unusual to it. There is a danger lurking in her prose, and even more cemented in this work, there is a real sense of young women coming into their own, stepping into their power, whatever that may be, but also accepting their rage in really validating ways. If you have been listening to Olivia Rodrigo on repeat since the new album dropped, you are going to want to dive into this book. Additionally, this just felt like the book for Hoosier teenagers that I craved when I was a teenager. Even like moving into young adulthood, I really did seek out, or was drawn inherently to, books that I heard were set in Indiana, things like All the Bright Places and even Turtles All the Way Down, that I expected to reflect my experience as a teenager in Indiana in some way. And to some extent, neither of those books really fully grasped my experience as a teenager in Indiana. That's not saying that they didn't grasp my experience as a teenager in other ways, but I've said before, and we're immediately going to prove the exception to the rule, don't worry. Growing up in southern Indiana and northern Indiana are very different things. The exception being that this is largely based in southern and central Indiana, and I, again, grew up in northern Indiana. However, this did feel very close to my experience, despite the fact that regardless of me hounding her, essentially since she texted me the concept of this book, I have been talking about Indiana Beach and joking that we need an Indiana Beach theme song in a minor key. We do not have an Indiana Beach appearance in this book. I know Sarah is rolling her eyes at me right now. I deserve it, but just stay with me for a moment, because the central conceit of this book is that we have 2 friends, Sadie and Logan, ditching their high school trip to an amusement park that is not Indiana Beach in order to go on this adventure driving around, just spending the day together. And part of the reason they're skipping this trip is that Sadie is fat and the rides don't accommodate her body, and she is feeling anxious about kind of just going around the park all day, kind of avoiding these rides and kind of filling time. And so they decide to spend this time together, and almost immediately we are thrust into the action because we stumble across this corn maze basically immediately. Now, is stumbling across a corn maze in the backwoods of Indiana unusual? Inherently on its face, no. At this time of year, at the beginning of the book, when school is essentially just getting out, yes. And the kind of setting of the corn maze, I think, is part of what really reflected my experience as an Indiana teenager here, but just a part of it. I grew up in the country, so the cornfields, the gravel roads, all of that is going to resonate a lot with me. But then even just the experiences these teens are talking about, the small town movie theaters, the things they encounter within the maze, and how this world is built out, which is really interesting because while in many ways it is a much more contained world than in a dark and starless forest, which was already pretty contained, it is also much bigger because there is an awareness of the outside world. There is a lot going on. We are sitting on that precipice of senior year and moving into college, and that is one of the things that admittedly made me the most emotional and is the reason I'm wearing this decade-old, faded, stained, and stretched sweatshirt from Ball State, because Ball State is where I went to college. It's where Sarah went to college, and it's where Sadie and Logan are dreaming of going to college. And they have these grand dreams, and grand dreams that to many aren't grand, but are grand to them and incredibly nostalgic to me, even down to the ways we kind of romanticize college, the ways I know I romanticize college. But there's a bit where Sadie talks about how they're going to have lunch on the quad together, and I don't remember ever having lunch on the quad. Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong if you ever had lunch on the quad. Anyone else that went to Ball State, correct me if I'm wrong if you ever had lunch on the quad. And this is not the first time that I've seen my college experience reflected in books, in that in Ashley Ford's Somebody's Daughter, it also talked about Ball State, and we also overlapped on campus. So she was recalling a very specific time and moment for me as well, and it made me emotional because of that. But in some ways, these moments are incredibly personal to me. So know that I know that this is a kind of singular experience, but it is a really important part of my response to this book and something I want to honor and acknowledge. So there is a line in the book where it says, we're going to be in the honors college at Ball State so we can live in the nice dorms, and we're going to experience real college life. And this means a couple of things to me. One, I did live in the honors college dorms. That is where I met Sarah, and it was the first year that they had been opened and renovated, and they were the nice dorms at the time. Now granted, it's like what, 14, 15 years later at this time, so I don't think they're the nice dorms anymore because they've been doing a lot of renovating, but that means something to me. But also just this idea of real college life in all capital letters, and just what real college life meant to me, and also what my experience of real college life was and was with Sarah, which I'm sure we may touch on a little bit more in our discussion. But with that, let's move a little deeper into the maze. So we enter this maze, we're in the action from the beginning, because what appears to be a seemingly normal, innocuous, random corn maze, I promise it's a lot more innocuous than it may sound. However, this particular maze is a little bit more sinister because soon they are trapped. But not just that, they start seeing dead bodies. Well, first they start seeing like replicas of their own things, including like Sadie's phone that is cracked at the same exact places. And then they start seeing dead bodies, which, believe me, is bad enough on its own, except these bodies are also them. So this is where we move into the horror elements, but also the kind of time warp elements of it. And they do reference video games a little bit in this. Sarah is a video game player. I am not. However, a book I loved when I was a teenager about video games and kind of living over and over video game lives was called Heir Apparent. It was set in like a medieval world, like knights and castles. It definitely wasn't in a corn maze, but reading this book did kind of spark my memory in some ways. And so I looked it up, and oddly enough, it was also published by Clarion, except like 19 years ago, and I'm not going to think about that too hard, am I? Sure not. But I definitely felt like some of that video game inspiration there. Another thing I was thinking about while wandering this corn maze was when I was in high school, we had a class, Indiana Literature, that was for 9 weeks. And one of our tasks around Halloween, purely because I think the teacher actually wanted to scare us, was to read urban legends set in Indiana, or like ghost stories set in Indiana, and kind of pull on this lore and this local lore very specifically. And I definitely got a little bit of a sense of that as we continued to go deeper into this maze, as well as potentially a little bit of the movie Susie Q. Not a whole lot, admittedly, but that also kind of plays into similar themes of like those local urban legends of sorts. And if you've seen that movie, it looms pretty large. But admittedly, this isn't a book for teenagers in the 90s. It's a book for teenagers now. And I think it explores and kind of deconstructs a lot of really complicated emotional interior things for teens today in a really active, complex way, because the setup for this is kind of deceptively simple, right? Moving into a haunted corn maze. Really engaging, really intriguing, but you are really far into the maze before you realize, oh wait, there is much more going on here. We start to learn a lot more about our characters as we get further and further. So at the beginning of the book, we're really riding on the action and the kind of concept here before we really start to move into both the weird and the real emotional heart of things. Because at the end of the day, these characters really have to unpack a lot of trauma in order to get out of this maze. And I think that the corn maze is a metaphor for working through trauma, though admittedly, I do not think at the beginning of this project that's where Sarah intended to go. The metaphor is still there, but I think it was one of those things where she turned a corner in the maze and was like, oops, there's the trauma. But I think it's incredibly important because it gives this visual, I think, for readers who may be working through very similar things. And it's looking at really nuanced situations that may be incredibly pertinent to teens today, especially when we're looking at things like online relationships and the dynamics that can develop there. So these two characters are slowly realizing that something is very, very wrong with this maze. And we get to explore the idea of the maze a good deal before we really become aware more consciously of a reset. We get introduced to the idea of a loop early, but we don't really know exactly what it means other than it's adding to the kind of odd ambiance. And I think the logistics of this maze are incredibly nuanced and complicated, and I know that I surely did not understand them fully. I'm really excited to get to pick Sarah's brain about this maze more specifically, because I can only imagine how complicated it was to kind of conceive of both the layout of it, the logistics of it, and then the rules of it in this supernatural world and this supernatural kind of liminal space. You know how I love a liminal space. So there's a lot of really intriguing bits here. And even amidst this supernatural and this horror, the jump scares, the more insidious moments, the psychological kind of thrills, there are also these moments that peek out that kind of further emphasize that Indiana summer experience. We have especially this room, because the different little areas in the corn maze that they kind of pop into, like the bigger areas, are called rooms. That felt like a much more long-winded explanation than it needed to be, I'm sorry. But one of the rooms they go into is a replica of a county fair, and a 4-H fair in particular, which Sarah specifically articulates. And a 4-H fair is something so specific, and that is what I grew up attending. And so you've got the rides, but you've also got the animals and the projects and the specific designs of the buildings that she talks about all feel incredibly familiar. And I know that that is not necessarily Indiana specific, especially amidst the Midwest, but it's something that feels so true to my experience, and I think will read as true to others who grew up in the Midwest. But when I was growing up, the fair was kind of what I looked forward to all summer. I grew up in the country. I didn't get to see people as much during the summer. I mean, summer library programs, 4-H if I was in it, different activities, church potentially, but the fair is where I really got to see a lot of my classmates. I looked forward to the fair. I looked forward to seeing people. I looked forward to riding rides. I looked forward to eating elephant ears, and it was just such a distilled, specific experience for me, and those are the kind of experiences that really resonated, as well as, again, her descriptions of a lot of things, which I talked about a little bit, or maybe even a lot, in A Dark and Starless Forest, but just the specifics of the description of even just the corn, but then also the way she described certain atmospheric elements that were also talked about in A Dark and Starless Forest in a way that really set the place. And again, A Dark and Starless Forest was also set in Indiana, but because I've been yelling about cicadas for the last however many weeks, and I specifically called out the description of cicadas in A Dark and Starless Forest when we talked about that for a feature Friday, I'm going to read this brief line that says, "I know most people think cicadas are annoying. I don't love to have them near me or anything, but their song is so familiar, it's like a safety blanket." And as much as I complain about cicadas on this channel, because when they're screaming here, they're interrupting the sound quality, I actually really do love the sound of cicadas inherently, because they are a natural kind of white noise machine for me, and they very specifically set a time and place of late summer. So there is something very true in that statement for me. So there's very specific places that are drawn in this maze, whether they're the kind of rural cornfields of Indiana or as the Steak and Shake taken over by teenagers late at night after a theater performance. Now granted, my town wasn't big enough for a Steak and Shake when I was growing up, but again, very specific experience. And so then as we're traveling through this maze, we are really focused on the friendship between Sadie and Logan, and I really expected this to explore their friendship, or test their friendship, I should say, more, and I was really pleasantly surprised that it wasn't about that. It was about particularly Sadie kind of coming to terms with a lot of things and growing amidst the maze, and also how she helped potentially others that she encountered amidst the maze grow, and also obviously work to escape. But there were never moments where we distrusted Sadie and Logan's friendship, and there was a moment seated kind of early where it set up this fear specifically in Sadie that maybe Logan would distrust her, and it quashed it pretty quickly. And then we saw through action how these two kept returning to each other again and again, and that was actually one of the signatures of them and how they operated within this maze, is that they always found each other, and they always sought each other out, and they were always trying to protect each other. And there was something just incredibly sweet in that. And also just this idea of friendship and how Sarah explores friendship, because she does write very queer books, and her protagonists so far have both been bisexual and very rooted in that, very proud of that. That is an inherent part of their characters and how they move about the world, but they are not in relationships, and their journeys in their books aren't about them entering in relationships. And so here, this central relationship was this friendship, and I love how it explored how serious friendships are, especially at this time of your life. There really is such a deep connection in finding someone who sees you, who can help ground you, who will help you through the maze. And both of these characters are willing to sit in the maze with the other, are willing to move from room to room, are willing to fight through the maze for each other and face some of their more central fears. And not fears in the kind of jump scare kind of way, but fears in the real existential kind of way. And that is one of the places that I found myself drawn to Sadie the most. These kind of intrusive thoughts of self-doubt for herself, this kind of undermining, self-deprecating inner monologue that she had for herself. I really thought that rang true for the character she is, yes, obviously, but also just it called to something in me, whether the me at 32, almost 33, but especially the me at Sadie's age, at like 17, 18, this idea of feeling a little lost among the corn in some ways. It is funny because in the acknowledgements for A Dark and Starless Forest, actually, I'll find it. So in her acknowledgements here, she says, "Thank you to all my many, many Indiana friends who have supported me along the way, even if you left Indiana." That's me, unfortunately. And then in What Stalks Among Us, there's a line, "I know most of my classmates were eager to get out of Indiana for exactly that reason, the endless crops." And I admittedly did get out and did leave, and I have a really complicated relationship with that some days, but I love how this book specifically, and Sarah's books in general, really go to bat for Hoosier teenagers. They give them representation, and they really explore the complexity, because I think it's so easy to kind of boil down these Midwestern states, especially the rural areas, to a much simpler idea than they are or there is. And these teens contain magnitudes. One, because all teens contain magnitudes, but also because when I was a teen, I felt like I contained magnitudes. And there's something really dynamic about feeling kind of stuck, whether it's stuck in the maze, stuck in your own mind, whatever, feeling stagnant in whatever way, and still fighting to become whoever you're going to become. And that happens everywhere, and you don't necessarily have to leave to find yourself. And I really love Sarah's books because while I am really drawn to romantic plot lines, I know, shocker, people like my friend Mandy, who I've talked about many a time because she's one of my best friends, aren't. And there are many teens, I'm sure, that aren't drawn to romantic plot lines. And here Sarah is offering a really empowering reflection of the teenage experience without that, and really honoring the importance of friendships, which I think is incredibly important. And looking at the idea of overcoming trauma and also forgiveness, whether that be others or yourself for pain caused or pain that you caused out of pain. And I think that there is something really profound there. I know there is something really profound there. And I think finding that amidst this corn maze is just so incredibly compelling. And because of that, it does feel very active, but also feels so incredibly true to that experience, and that it's not going to happen on the first try. You're going to stumble through a lot of false starts, and it's okay as long as you're still getting yourself back up, and eventually it will happen. Eventually you will find some kind of peace, some kind of freedom, or at least know that that is what I am hoping for you, wishing for you. So I know I've talked longer than I anticipated already, and I haven't really dove into the specifics of this, but I feel like the setup is the thing, and we can always dive more into the nitty-gritty with Sarah when we talk about this book with her. And again, if you have any questions, anything you'd like to see touched on in that conversation, please leave them below. If you've read this book and you have thoughts, please leave those below as well. Full disclosure, this book did make me cry. That's no guarantee it will make you cry though, so you obviously need to read it to report back. If you are friends from back home, I definitely think this will be of interest to you. It really spoke to me in that way. So let me know what you're thinking. Like and subscribe if you feel like it, but would be greatly appreciated. Read something good. Most importantly, as always, this if you haven't yet. Oh, before I forget, I may do a giveaway of this book. I ordered 2 copies. I want to say accidentally, but I don't think it was accidental. I think I did it purposefully. I just can't remember. So I may do that. If I do that, it will be on Instagram. I'll have that linked below, but I've never done a giveaway before, so I don't know. Feel free to leave comments, yay or nay, in favor or not of the giveaway below, but it's something I'm considering. So read something good again, and yeah, bye.